And bingo, bango. And again, be open to any questions regarding the request of repairs, okay? The whole goal is for all of us to bring questions to the table. It helps me and it'll help you as well, and also your team members on this call. So negotiating repairs, utilizing the RR and the RRRR form. So what is the R of the request of repairs and the seller's response to the buyer's request? Well, it's like it says on the presentation. It's a request for repairs and the seller's response, buyer replies to that request. Use these to facilitate the negotiation. We're gonna transition and we're gonna be the buyer's agent, okay? So most of the entire presentation will be directed as you being the buyer, agent involved. You represent the buyer. Your position is to navigate and close the deal. Now, most of the stuff is all communications, team. Communications. That's the number one reason deals fall out apart because the agent is not communicating, lack of communication. And that's not the role and the responsibility you want to be. Communications with your buyer, communications with the listing agent, communications with the inspections, right? And it could be general inspection, termite inspection, sewer inspections, plumbing inspections, many different elements to inspections. Whatever the buyer's requesting, do so within the time frame. Typically, the purchase agreement allows the inspection contingency 17 days to do any and all inspections. Then the buyer has to make a decision. Do they want to buy this property or not, or put a request of repairs, okay? What if the seller says that they're selling the property as is? Okay, that's a very good question. Let me just point this out. All property are sold in its as-is condition. All properties are sold in its as-is condition, meaning that the seller is selling the property as is. Now, it's a give and take, ladies and gentlemen. It's a give and take, meaning that the buyer can go through the motions and know that the property is being sold in its as-is condition. But does that mean that the buyer cannot ask for any type of repairs, replacement, credit, or a price reduction? The answer is yes, they can. That's the whole purpose of these two forms, is to allow the buyer to navigate certain things that the buyer is asking for. Now, at the end of the day, the seller can say three things. The seller can say, yes, I'm willing to do any of the buyer's requests. No, I am not willing to do all of the buyer's requests, but I'm willing to do X, Y, and Z. Or the seller can say, nope, property is being sold in its as-is condition. Therefore, we are not going to do any repairs, replace, credit, or even a price reduction. The property is being sold in its as-is condition, and that's perfectly fine. The cool thing about all this is that the buyer can send a second request and ask for maybe different terms. So just because the seller says no to your first buyer request doesn't mean that the buyer cannot ask for a second request if the first request has been declined or maybe not favorable to the buyer. That's the awesome part. Now, your job is just to navigate the process. That's it. Whatever the buyer wants is the way we're going to approach it. Now, your advice, your expertise, and your knowledge is very, very crucial through this entire process, and the understanding. But at the end, this is where communications with the listing agent is very, very important. Why? Because the listing agent can also influence the buyer. The listing agent can navigate that conversation and make it a win-win if you do have good dialogue and good communications with the listing agent. So I want to make sure that we're on the same page and we're seeing eye to eye, because if we don't see eye to eye with the listing agent, it's going to be very, very difficult to navigate a request and more so getting something for the buyer. Now, at the end of the day, the buyer can be completely okay with the property being sold as is, meaning not asking any requests of repairs, not asking for a credit, and obviously not asking for a price reduction. It's what we call the give and take, right? Buyer gives, seller gives, buyer gives, seller gives, to make this a win for all. Because if the seller says no to that request, that sometimes puts a buyer in a position, well, you know what? Maybe this is not the right property. There's just too many issues with the home. Maybe I'll pass. And now we're in a cancellation. Okay. Well, you know, I don't want to cancel transactions, right? We want to make it a win and ultimately get the deal closed. So that way we all get paid, right? That's the number one goal here. So any questions regarding the two forms we're going to be talking about today, the RR and the RRRR form, the request of repairs and the seller's response, meaning it's no difference than a counter offer, okay? You submit the offer, the seller sends you either a counter offer or a multiple counter offer. And if the buyer is not in terms with that, then we'll send a buyer counter offer number 2. And it's like ping pong, right? Back and forth until the alignment is there. And then we have mutual agreement, we open escrow. And if we are still not in the meeting of the minds, meaning the buyer and the seller do not see eye to eye, then we just continue until we can iron out the position where the buyer's happy and the seller's happy. Then we once open escrow as well. The same is with the request of repairs. You know, it's just going back and forth. If the seller says no, then obviously you can send a second request, a third request. But there's going to be a point in time where the seller's going to say, no, enough is enough, to know how to play your cards correctly. Okay, how does the request of repairs work? Okay, list of repairs can be too long on zip forms, will automatically attach the text flow addendum. So if the buyer is requesting itemized list of things to be repaired, don't worry. Zip form automatically will attach the overflow addendum, because if you know that the RR form only has so many lines on it, just keep typing away, type away, and it'll eventually create a second overflow addendum. So it'll have everything that you type. So just as reinsurance, you know, you can add all that information into the text overflow, and that'll help you present your buyer's concerns regarding the property. Okay. Termite repair can be requested based upon an already conducted inspection. So part of the buyer's due diligence, right? The buyer also can do, as I mentioned, physical inspections, sewer, plumbing, structure, roof, chimney, electrical, permits, HOA, but they can also do termite, okay, as part of that request of repairs. So once you set up all of your inspections, you know, you set the time and date, that's also part of the request of the request of repairs, where the buyer can ask for termite clearance, meaning, you know, if the property has infestation of termites, well, the buyer can ask for that as part of the agreement. Is on top of all these items, we are also requesting that that the buyer, that the buyer also submits a request for a termite clearance. All right, meaning they're going to probably tent the home, and then you'll have a clearance report saying that there is no more issues regarding infestation of termite. Okay, so part of the request is the in general inspections and also termite inspection as part of this agreement. Also use the request for credits and price reduction in lieu of repairs. Total credits may not exceed lender allowance credit. So be very mindful, folks, okay? And what I mean by mindful is that if the credit is $30,000, right, we're asking for 30, you know, it may red flag the underwriter, okay, especially in a traditional loan when there's finance involved, meaning you got to be very cautious in how you approach this. My recommendation, speak with the lender, okay? Once you know that the buyer has done all their inspections and the buyer's saying, gosh, there's a lot of issues with this home, we still want it, but let's just see if if the seller is willing to give us some type of credit. Now, yeah, the seller can give credit. So there's three things that the seller can do, okay? And these can be individually, or it can be a total of all. The buyer can ask for credit, the buyer can ask for repairs, and the buyer can ask for the price reduction. Guess what? The buyer can ask for all three simultaneously as well, meaning he can ask for credit, he can ask for certain things to be repaired, and we could still ask price reduction. So let's say that it's $20,000 worth of items, right? Now you've spoken with the lender, and the lender says, look, we only have 10,000 allowance of closing costs. The rest, unfortunately, we cannot use. Remember, underwriter, lender, speak with the lender to make sure you have clarity in how you approach this, because you don't want to be caught with your pants down and now you cannot utilize all of the credit that was given to by the seller. Because if that's the case, then the seller can retain that difference back, and it goes back to the seller's net proceeds. So how you navigate this is very, very crucial and very important, is break it apart. Maybe you can the seller is willing to do $3,000 of the repairs, and then the rest of the 3,000, the 7,000, right, can go towards closing costs, and the remainder of that $10,000 from the 20,000, maybe we can ask the seller to reduce the price of the home. And let's say you submitted an offer for $780, and the seller is fine because they want to close this because they have an urgency that they want to sell this property and move. They don't have time to put the property back on the market, fish for another buyer, go through the negotiations, and then ultimately get another request for repairs that stops that from continuing, and that just delays the process. At the end, there has to be flexibility, right? The seller has to be flexible, the buyer has to be flexible. But let's just say that the buyer is requesting 20,000, 3,000 of repairs, 7,000 of credit, and then 10,000 price reduction. Guess what? You can ask for all three, and you can put that on that request of repairs, all three. So 780 was the purchase price. Now you're going to put the purchase price shall be, right, 770 plus 7,000 of closing costs, credit towards closing costs. And then 3,000 can be that the seller is going to take care of the termite, report. Okay, and that comes up to 3,500 or 3,000. So you have maximized, right? Maximize the 20,000 that you are requesting. Now, on that flip side, folks, okay, I want you to understand that all property, again, are sold in its as-is condition, meaning the seller can say no, right? I said this early. They can say no, buy it, and you're buying it as is. Now the buyer has to question if they want to move forward with it or decide to cancel. This is why you have your contingency in place, ladies and gentlemen. That's why you have what is the wall that protects the buyer's deposit. Every contingency that you release is now getting closer for the seller to go after damages if the buyer doesn't perform and ultimately releases any and all contingencies. Now the buyer's deposit is in jeopardy, it's in risk. Okay, so I want to make sure that you understand your role. Remember what I said earlier, we are focused as a buyer's agent, okay, not a seller. We're working as a buyer's agent. Our job is to navigate and make sure that we do not jeopardize the buyer's deposit, right? But more so, the critical component is this request, because this can be a deal killer if the buyer doesn't get what the buyer has requested. But it also can be an advantage to the buyer, because what if he or she or they are getting a great deal, right? And that can also happen, or they see the bigger picture, right? Well, I'm not going to worry about this $10,000 that I requested. Seller said, no, I still want this property. There's still a lot of potential. This is where you come in as a professional, right? To navigate and make sure that the buyer understands every element, every step of the process. Seller gets copies of the report. So part of the request is, again, if you're going to ask for request of repairs or credit, prove it to the seller. They're going to want evidence. So part of the request, right, you're also going to attach the reports, right? The termite report, general inspection, chimney estimates, foundation, sewer estimates, okay, that need to be addressed by the seller. No one is going to just say, oh, you're asking for $20,000. Okay, we'll give you the $20,000. It's far and few, folks, that will happen. Any savvy listing agent and any seller will say, okay, show me evidence that justifies this request. Show me the reports. So part of your responsibility and your TC, if you're using a TC, is to provide the proof. Here's the report, Mr. and Mrs. Seller. Here's the termite. Here's the home inspection. Here's the sewer inspection. And these are what the inspections have in return. Now you have something to back you up regarding that request. Does that make sense? Okay. So make sure that you include copies of the report. Sellers shall share with these future buyers if requested is declined in the transaction fails. If seller agrees and buyer signs the RR form, the identified contingencies are automatically removed by buyer's signature. Okay, so part of the request of repairs and the seller's response will dictate if we're going to move forward. And part of the agreement that the seller may say to the buyer says, look, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, we are willing to do the credit. We are willing to do the repairs. We are willing to do the termite, but in lieu of, you must release this as a condition. Otherwise, if you don't release it, we're not going to do the work. Now, I'm going to switch my hat a little bit. Now I'm going to be the listing agent, right? Representing the seller. I want to caution you, okay, the importance of your fiduciary responsibility, okay? You as representing either party, but more so now, flipping the head and working as a listing agent. You want to make sure that the seller is aware that there is a request, but more so that the seller does not do any of those requests until we have a commitment from the buyer that they're continuously going to go forward with the transaction. Meaning that if the buyer is requesting, don't go out and tell your seller, go ahead and start doing the work. What if it's a replacement of a AC, right? Or cleaning out the sewer line that it's going to be $5,000-$6,000, right? You want to make sure that the buyer is full committed to the process. And if the buyer is not willing to release these as a condition, do not recommend your seller to do anything until the buyer has released that as a condition, because the buyer has leverage because of the contingency, and the buyer may decide to cancel, and now your seller spent several $1,000s, which was not necessary. Okay, so want to make sure you understand, don't have your seller do any repairs or any agreements until the buyer commits to releasing this as part of the agreement. And that's where the contingency removal and also the seller's respond will also have a section on that form that says, we'll do the repairs, but in lieu of, the buyer must release that as part of the condition, okay? All right, we have a question here. Being said, listing to release all contingency in order to get offers accepted, is that allowed? Rich, that's a Richard question. So here's my thoughts about this on a non-contingent scenario, okay? It worries me. It worries me when a buyer is going with a non-contingent, okay? When they release all contingencies in order to get their offer accepted, you have to let the buyer know that if you release physical inspections, disclosures, appraisals, and loan contingencies, that the buyer is also jeopardizing their deposit, okay? We as brokers never recommend any buyer to release any contingencies right off the bat. Now, there is timelines, right? timelines where the buyer does release this as conditions, and that's 17 days, right? That's already defaulted on the purchase agreement. You can modify that and ask for maybe a 10-day inspection to release that as a condition. Appraisal can be 12 or 15 days. You can modify it. But as brokers, we never want to advise our buyers to release that automatically from the very beginning. Now, to answer your question, Richard, does that happen? Yes, it happens quite often, where we have people as part of the condition. Why? It's because they're in a multiple bidding war. There's other buyers that are willing to submit higher offers, release contingencies, and therefore it's either the buyer does or the buyer doesn't. If the buyer is uncomfortable with it, then I do not encourage them to do so. Okay, if it's a gut feeling, because what is happening when the buyer releases certain contingencies or all? It's exposing their deposit. And then we don't want the buyers to start pointing fingers while the agent said to go ahead, because that was the only reason we're going to buy the property. Now, I caution you as well. There's buyers out there that are very sophisticated. They understand what they're doing, and therefore they're okay releasing contingencies because their whole intent and whole purpose is still to buy the property. Give you an example. Property is a tear down. Property is going through a remodel. They're going to gut out the entire property and restructure everything, add square footage, or maybe upgrade it. And the buyer is perfectly fine with the condition of the property, then it's okay. The buyer knows what the intent is. The buyer is aware of the overall condition of the property, and therefore they're going to do all the necessary repairs to the property, then it's okay. We're good. As long as we got the thumbs up from the buyer, then we can go with that motion because they know exactly how to repair, replace certain things. What if the property is on a raised foundation, right? And we have certain areas of the foundations that are weak, okay? Or that are collapsing, right? And have you ever walked, and probably I've seen it, you walk to a house and you can see that the floor is actually dipping to the right, dipping to the left. It's because there's some structural issues with the property. Now, everything can be repaired, but it's also money, depending on the severity of the scenario and the situation. It can be a couple of thousand, or it can be a few $1,000s that can add up pretty quick. This is why the buyer has to know what they're getting themselves in, because everyone needs to have a little skin in the game, okay? Meaning that the buyer has to put a little skin in the game. That's where the deposit comes into play. The seller also has to have a little skin in the game because they don't want to possibly lose this potential buyer, because maybe this buyer is, offering a higher price than the other offers that came in. Maybe they're going 20, 30,000, 50, 60,000 above the list price, or even the highest offer that they have was 60, 50,000 less. So that's more pocket to the seller, right? There's more net to the seller. So the seller has to also understand their role and their position. But there also has to be some skin in the game from both parties, the buyer and the seller, okay? Any questions regarding this request and how it works when it comes to credits and disclosures and reports? All right.
Simon, I have a quick question.
Yes, sir.
So I've been in situations where we've gone through the repair for request and then the response after all the contingencies were removed, or even there were no contingencies, but we still went through that process, which is fine. But am I right as far as the timing? Is this all usually happening within the investigation contingency?
That's correct.
For the most part. Okay.
That is correct, Miguel. So the contract is very defined and very clear, right? The contract stipulates that the buyer has 17 days to release that as a condition. Now, with that being said, can the buyer ask for an extension of that time to release that condition? And the answer is yes. But you got to be proactive. If you know you're going to need more time, there might be a delay, there might be some issues that did not allow the buyer enough adequate time to do their inspections. Okay, so if that's the case, then it is your duty to ask for an extension of time to release that condition. How do you do it? You request it on the ETA form, the extension time addendum. That form provides the extension to release one or all contingencies. If you know that the 17 days just around the corner and there's no way that the buyer can release that as a condition because he has additional inspections coming in, then you want to at least 48 hours, right? By the 15th day, if that's the case, or if it's a 10-day release of contingency by the 8th day, if it's a 12-day by the 10th day, be requesting that extension. Now, I want to be very crystal clear too, that this will only work if there is good communications with the opposing agent. If there is lack of communication, no communication, bumping heads through this entire process, it's going to be very hard to ask for an extension, because guess what? The seller doesn't have to grant that extension. They can say, nope, we're not going to extend. You either release it or you cancel escrow. And those are your ultimatum, folks. That's your ultimatums. Okay.
Quick question.
Yes.
Touching on that, is it safe to assume that you should probably have a conversation with the other side's agent, about all this before submitting a request for repairs, just so that they anticipate it, they're not hit out of nowhere with the paperwork first, and then you have to follow up and explain your position?
Okay. You mean prior to submission of an offer?
Well, prior to submission for the repair request. So if I call the other agent and say, hey, we're in this deal, but my clients want this, that, and the third, they're going to submit a request. And can you talk to your sellers and see how they feel about it or whatever?
Got it. 100%, Miguel. Be proactive. Okay. Don't just send out a request. Get on the phone and say, Mr. Agent, Mrs. Agent, here's the scenario we have. We're going to be sending a request of repairs. I don't want to blindside you and send out an email with a laundry of items that a buyer is requesting. Be very proactive and then have a conversation. Hey, Miguel, I'm giving you a heads up. After careful consideration, the buyers love the place, but they do have some concerns after all the inspections and reports we have. Here are some of the issues we have. The biggest ones are X, Y, and Z. I prepared a request of repairs. I'm just waiting for the buyer to execute and sign so I can send it over to you as part of the request. Now, that's your proactive approach, all right? You're being engaged, you're having conversations with the listing agent, but more so you're asking for some incentives instead of just slapping that request of repairs, right? And hope that the listing agent, responds back. Because even so, I also want to be clear on this, even so, you can send that request, the seller does not have to respond, to the buyer's request. Now that's kind of crappy, right? You send out a request and you get radio silence, meaning you don't get a response from the listing agent. You're not getting a response from the sellers, and you're like questioning, and your buyers are texting you and calling you. Hey, have we received any answers from our request? We're getting close to that 17 days and seller has not responded back to either if they're going to do it or not. Okay. This is where communication is crucial, folks. Good dialogue, good conversations, being very proactive and engaging with the opposing agent will definitely give you a better open concept, right, of the avenues of relationship building, but more so to get an answer. I need an answer so we can close this deal, or if we need to stop and cancel this because it's just too much for the buyer. Remember, you're going to have first-time home buyers. You're going to have buyers that dabble into it as investors. You're going to have buyers that buy and sell, buy and sell. So you're going to have all different categories of buyers. The newer first-time home buyer is going to have a lot of questions. Are going to be a little scared, right? Because they think that all the properties overall condition has to be up to par. And maybe the house was built in the 40s and 50s, you know, and a home that's 60, 70 years old is going to be, you know, not at the best condition, right? Well, and then you have homes that are immaculate, right? You have homes in the 20s and 30s that they've done so many upgrades to it that the home is in mint condition, right? So you got to weigh it out. But here's the big picture. The biggest challenge and the biggest obstacles that I see real estate agents is lack of communication. Be proactive, be engaged, make those calls and get a commitment. Because at the end is not what you or your client is, how can we together accomplish the number one goal to close this deal? I hope, Miguel, I kind of answer your question.
You did, yeah. It kind of led me to a second question, but I don't want to hold up the show.
No, go right ahead.
Okay, so on the other slide, it said to share with the lender any credits that are agreed upon.
Well, here's my take on this, okay? And you know, I can definitely probably get a lender to, you know, give me an answer on this. But when you put something on the purchase agreement, right? Especially the new RPA, right? You want to limit of what you put on there because you don't want to red flag the lender. And it's not really the lender, it's the underwriter. I want to be very clear on this is the less you put, the better you're at. The less you put, the better you're at. Well, what do you mean by that, Simon? Well, what I mean is, remember who gets a copy of the purchase agreement? The lender. And that lender has to send it over to the processor. The processor's job is to package this and send it over for final conditions and approval to the underwriter. The underwriter's number one objective and goal is to dissect and make sure that this is a clean package that they can sell it to the investors, right? That will buy off this mortgage, because their number one goal here is, can you come in the, are you going to be, can you come in here? That's fine. That's fine. But can you come in here real quick, Jimmy, and just close the training room? You're good, Natalie, no problem. So sorry about that. If you hear a little bit of back noise, folks, is we're having our grand opening tomorrow, and I have my team doing the balloons. So we need to just close the sliding door. Thanks, Jimmy. Okay, so going back to the lender, right? So the lender will package this, the processor will send it over to the underwriter. The underwriter is the final part of, you know, whatever conditions, if they're going to decline or approve it. So our number one objective here is that we want the approval, but if they see that you put a home inspection, they see that you requested a sewer inspection, they see that you put a termite inspection as part of the agreement. And once buyer and seller sign and execute the RPA, that opens up the can of worms that the lender can request a copy of these repairs. Even though the seller may decline the request, right? And the buyer's perfectly fine buying the property as is. But also what you have to understand, and I want to stress this, is that the lender and the underwriter may request as part of that condition a copy of these reports. And if these reports look really scary, the underwriter can say, look, we're not going to lend on this because it's a big risk. Because the lender's view and how they see it is, if the buyer buys this property and comes back with a $50,000 worth of repairs, what's to say that the buyer will default on this loan and we don't get our money back? That's the way underwriters see it. So we want to make sure that we limit on how much information we put. Now, don't get me wrong. Just because you don't put it on the RPA doesn't mean you cannot do all inspections, okay? This is where the form BIE come into place. B as in boy, I as in Ida, E as in Edward. Buyer's inspection election form, okay? When you get a chance, go on zip forms and pull that form, buyer inspection election. What that form stipulates, it allows the buyer to do additional inspections. And it's no guesswork, okay? Because the buyer's agent may not know all the elements to every aspect of the home. But that form, the buyer election form, allows the buyer to do additional inspection. And it lines it up very detailed. General inspection, roof inspection, termite inspection, electrical inspection, HOA, lot, what do they call it? Lot size surveyor inspections, meaning they're measuring the lot size to make sure that the accuracy of the lot size is what it shows of a 5,000 or 10,000. So it aligns all of the inspections that the buyer can do within the 17 days. Now, most agents do just the general inspections. Now, as you get more and more seasoned in your position, you got to start asking those questions. If you know a home was built in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, you know that the, the home has many years now, right? It's no different than us. Look at me 20 years back, 30 years, I didn't have all this gray hair. But as I age, right, it's you know, wear and tear, right? I cannot perform the same like I was as a teenager. I cannot perform the same as a 20-year-old, and more so now, myself and someone in their 70s or 80s, right? It's just the elements of it. Well, it's no difference to a home, wear and tear. Now, if the seller has not done any upgrades to the property and it's been in its original condition, well, you're going to come across some issues, okay? But at the end, I caution you to be very, very careful in what you put on our purchase agreement. In your back of your mind, you should already know the buyer can do all inspections on the property, every inspection, okay? So the less, the better on the RPA. Any additional questions regarding that?
Is the BIE part of the RPA?
It is addressed on the purchase agreement, yes. I don't
So
remember on top of my head where it categorizes on it, but there's a section where it says about buyer's responsibility, buyer's avenue of inspections. But it is on your zip forms, okay? And I can show you a sample of it right now when we finish the presentation. You know, I want to make sure that I respect your time too. We got about another 10 more minutes left before we conclude this. So I want to try to condense this, okay? But if I have time, I will actually show you the zip forms. Better yet, why don't I do that now? Let me show it to you right now.
Okay, and I only ask because I'm wondering if the underwriter will get a copy of that BIE and
No,
possibly
that's the cool thing. The buyer will not.
Okay.
Okay, that's just amongst you and the buyer. So BIE form, right? Here it is.
Okay.
Okay, so this is the buyer's investigation election, okay? So this is the form that you can, and it's only for the buyer. It doesn't even have the seller's signature. So part of your responsibility when you're actually having conversation, a consulting appointment, right? Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, I want to make sure that you have every element of understanding of the role and responsibility as a buyer. You know, you have any inspections you can do on the property. You don't have to, as an agent, remember everything. What do I have to explain to the buyer? Just populate this inspection and election form, put in the address, right? And then here it says the importance of property investigation, disclosures, right? Buyer's rights and duties, broker advice, okay? Buyer's investigation. Buyer representative agrees that the buyer has independently considered the available inspections, because now the buyer cannot come back to us and says, Miguel, Simon, you did not tell me that I can do additional inspections. If you would have provided this form would have protected you from a potential complaint, because now it lays it out of any and all inspections that the buyer can do regarding the process. General inspections, pest, termite, chimney, electrical, heat, lead paint, plumbing, square footage, structural, easement and encroachments, foundations, lot size, boundaries, pool, roof, sewer, septic tank, soil stability survey, tree, wells, water system and components, random gases, I don't even know how to pronounce that word, asbestos, methane gas, mold permits, public records, zoning, government requirements, vacant land, construction financing, okay? All of these additional inspections, natural hazard reports, environmental surveys, and you can add additional ones such as, HOA investigation as part of it here. Then you put your buyer's contact information, they sign, and they get a copy of this. And now if something happens, right, you have documentation that says, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, we told you the importance of investigations. We told you what your rights and duties are as part of the exercise reasonable care to protect yourself, including discovery of any legal, practical, technical implications of unknown disclosures and facts to investigate and verify the information and facts that you know or that are within your diligent attention and observation. Bam. Okay. How can a buyer come back to you and say, Simon, Miguel, you didn't tell me I can do a chimney inspection. You didn't tell me I can do electrical inspections. You didn't tell me that I can go out and get a contractor to evaluate the structure of the property. Even though they don't do it, okay? Let's say they don't do it and they still want to buy the property with no inspections, right? They're fine with the property. You still want to provide this as part of the arsenal, because this, in case they come back and says, well, Simon, I didn't know that I can do inspections. Well, yeah, you declined to do any inspections. You chose not to. And then we did provide you with the buyer investigation election form. Okay. Now with this also, there's another form that I also want to bring to your attention. Okay. And that form is the BIW. Okay. So the BIW, which now consists of the buyer's inspection waiver. Okay. Now, if there's certain things that may be a red flag, right? Then you want to have the buyer sign off on this waiver. The importance of investigations, the right and duties to the buyer. And then what are they choosing to waive? Well, 3A, 3B, and 3C says the following. Home inspection waiver. Broker recommends that a buyer obtain a home inspection, even if the seller or the broker has provided buyers with copies of home inspection reports obtained by seller or previous buyer. If you do not do so, you're acting against the advice of the brokers. Okay, then they have signed initial. Buyer has decided not to obtain a general inspection at this time, unless buyer makes a sequential election in writing during inspections. Okay, that includes termite as well. And you can also put here other. Broker recommends that the buyer obtain inspections for the following items. You know that there's some concerns with the sewer. We saw the reports and from a previous, right? The buyer on the previous escrow canceled because of this inspection, right? And the listing agent provided you with a copy of that inspection report. And you know that sewer is in bad condition, that at any moment of time, that sewer can collapse or is, in really bad condition. But the buyer still wants to go forward and is okay without doing their own inspection and they're relying on this previous inspection, you still want to get this waiver, because even though they're not, even though they're getting a copy of a previous inspection from a previous buyer, they're still waiving their right to do their own inspection, right? You want to have them sign this waiver. And here is where you're going to put, broker has recommended the buyer obtain this inspection. We're telling the buyer, you saw that inspection, right? But geez, I still recommend that you get your own inspection on it. No, I think I'm okay with it. I still want to buy the property. Then you reference this and you protect your rear, get them to sign this form saying, we acknowledge, we determine that they don't want to do an inspection, but the broker has recommended that as an option to make sure that you're completely satisfied. What you're doing is protecting yourself from a future liability. Okay? Any questions regarding this? Cool. All right, let's briefly go through this. How does the RRR form works? Under section 1, list those repairs a seller will not make. Seller agreement is conditional. Buyer must agree to remove and identify contingency. Buyer may accept seller's response or counter terms in section B1, or make a new request on request RR number 2. Buyer's signature removes, identifies contingencies. No signature is needed on the contingency removal of the CR form, but does so cause no harm and can be helpful. So even though it says this, in my personal opinion, I want to make sure that I cover all bases. I'm going to have the buyer sign off on the contingency removal. Even though the request of repairs on the seller's response says that it does not necessarily need be to send out the CR form, for peace of mind, will still reinforce it and still have the buyer sign off on the contingency removal. That's just my personal opinion, and I press hard on this with the agents here in the office. If buyer counters, then the seller needs to complete section 3 of the RRR form. Otherwise, this section is left blank. Seller's obligation to make repairs, folks. Okay, the answer is no, with 2 exceptions. One, the RPA paragraph 11, property is sold as is. It already says that on the RPA. On the date of acceptance, seller must repair damages to the property that occur between that date of acceptance and before close of escrow. So let me make sure that we're all on the same page, okay? And I'm going to do this as fast as possible. If the buyer submits an offer gets accepted, you're in escrow and you're doing your due diligence and you put a request of repairs, right? And the seller comes back and says, property's being sold as is, we're not going to do any repairs. Okay, that's legitimate. But let's just say that the seller now and the buyer in escrow, and there's a plumbing issue, right? Now the plumbing is draining, one of the pipes busted and there's water. Well, the buyer, the seller cannot say, well, you're buying the property as is. I am not going to repair that. If it's something that transpires during escrow, the seller is responsible to repair if it's something that it happened during the process, okay? If a window breaks, if a door is jammed, if a water pipe is broken or a sewer line, right? The seller cannot say, well, you know what? I'm not living in the property anymore, but I know we have sewer issues and it broke and you have this foul odor. I'm just going to sell it as is and pawn it on the buyer. The answer is no. The buyer would have recourse because the owner is still the seller, and therefore the seller has to repair it, replace any issues regarding the property. So I want to make sure that we're clear on the expectations when it comes to that request. All property are sold as is, yes. But if something happens within the timeline of that 30-day, that 45-day escrow, then the responsibility falls on the seller to repair or replace it. Make sense? Any questions? Okay. Exception number 2, repairs. Okay, we have a question. Is there responsibility to disclose anything they know about the property? The answer is yes, Richard. Any known material fact that the seller knows about the property must be part of the seller's disclosures. Okay, that's where the transfer disclosure, better known as the TDS. That's also the seller's property questionnaire, better known as the SPQ. And it says, and it defines there, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, are you aware of the following? And the following is X, Y, and Z. Mr. Seller, are you aware of any foundation? Mr. Seller, do you know of any wall, roof, electrical? And if the answer is yes, they must provide that as part of the disclosure. Yes, we are aware that there is a roof issues. The roof is 45 years old and it's in need of repair or replacement. As long as the seller has disclosed it, then they're in the green. Okay, they're not liable. But does that mean just because the property is in bad condition, does that mean that the seller has to do the repairs? No, it doesn't. But if there is a hole on the roof, right, and that happened during escrow, then yeah, the seller is responsible to take care of that issue. Okay, so to answer your question, Richard, yes, it does fall as the responsibility that the seller must disclose. Repair requires by the state and local law, as example, point of sales, bracing of the water heater, retrofitting slide and shower doors, installing operator smoke detectors. Law enables cost of repairs to be negotiated, but parties may not contract that, avoid them. Okay, so part of that is any point of sale of requirements by state or law, then yeah, common sense says, yeah, that the seller is responsible to brace the water if that's part of the process. Maybe they bought the water heater many years and never braced the water heater, and now the buyer is requesting that, then yeah, that's something that unfortunately the seller will have to take care of it because it's a statute, California or federal statute, okay? Is seller obligated to make any repairs? No requirements. Under paragraph 11 states property improvements may not be billed to code in compliance with current law or have had permit issues. Known conditions must be disclosed by the seller, but they are not required to be repaired. Okay. Special consideration when it comes to VA and FHA loans. Repairs of conditional by the seller may be required by buyer's lender. Use car form FHA or VA notice and addendum FVA to make request repairs for those loans. Buyers should determine seller's response before removing the contingency. Otherwise, the lender may not fund and the buyer could be in breach of the contract 100%. If you are representing a client that does have an FHA or VA loan, make sure that you include the VFA form because that protects the buyer. Evaluating the repair request. Material defects disclosed in the inspection report must be disclosed to other prospecting buyers. Other buyers may want similar repairs. Seller price may be affected if the sale is canceled and the property is relisted. If buyer isn't satisfied with the repairs, seller may face post-close negotiations or liability. This is a very common reason for seller to offer credit or price concession instead of making the repairs. Yeah. You have a seller that is 80 years old, as an example, they're probably not in their position to do any repairs. They rather, in lieu of the repairs, so look, I don't want to deal with it. We're just going to offer you $10,000. You replace the AC, you replace the sewer, and that's the credit. That credit goes back to the buyer. It goes as part of the closing costs. So I've had this question asked many times is, does the buyer get a check at the close of escrow? The answer is no. No. So what happens is escrow will calculate the figures, right? Escrow will now conclude what the balance of closing costs and down payment the buyer will have to come into the table to close and fund this. So let's say that it's a $20,000 down payment plus $8,000 of closing costs, but the seller has given $10,000 as an example, right, of $10,000 for credit in lieu of the repairs. So when the escrow officer is calculating the figures, instead of bringing in the $20,000 for down payment and the $8,000 for closing costs, Now that is reduced because the seller is giving concession to the buyer. So now the buyer will come in with only 18,000 instead of 20,000, or excuse me, 28,000. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's the credit. The credit that the seller will give goes towards the closing costs and sometimes the down payment. Alternatives to making repairs. Form RR enables the buyer to ask for repairs, credit, or price reduction. Seller may offer a credit or a reduction in price in lieu of making the repairs. Repairs are habitably conditioned by the seller, may be required by buyer's lender. If the lender disallows the credit, here it is, the lender decision must be respected. The credit will not be paid. Solution, ask the lender about the maximum credit advance. Yeah, as I said earlier, if you're representing the buyer, make sure, folks, make sure that you're in constant communications with the lender, right? Ask the lender, hey, look, property is in pretty bad condition. We're going to ask for requests. And if the seller grants, what is the maximum allowed of credit that we can ask for? Well, the maximum is 8,000. Shoot. If they offer 10,000, there's still a $2,000 discrepancy. Maybe you can use that as part of the price reduction, right? So you can, navigate that as well. Additional resources under the California Association of Realtors Legal Q&A, request of repairs, use of RR and RR form. If you want a copy of this, please send me an email, and I'd be more than happy to send you this request. I'm going to, on the chat, I'm going to put my email address just in case if you want me to send you a copy of this request of repairs and form. Okay. All right, team. Well, that concludes the presentation. Any final questions before we close for the afternoon? Thanks, Miguel. Appreciate you. Good talking to you, and asking some good questions. All right, awesome, team. Well, thank you very much. Have a phenomenal afternoon. For KW South Bay tomorrow, we have our award ceremony. Starts at 12. Be here by 11:30. We're going to have foods and drinks and all kinds of goodies here, and we're going to be announcing our 2021 production for the top performers. Love to see you here. That'll be tomorrow, Wednesday, 12 o'clock. Okay. Thanks. We'll see you soon.
Thank you, Simon.
Thank you, Hope.